may I, on behalf of this committee, congratulate you on your promotion to your new senior position in the Metropolitan Police.
Thank you, Chair.
We had hoped to have the Commissioner here, but I gather that he is abroad.
That's correct. He's abroad in operational matters.
Yes, of course. He's asked that you come, but we will see him at a later stage about the vexed question of police funding, which
That's
I know
correct.
is...
He's offered to come and see you about all matters.
Indeed. Now, can I at the start say, you sent out a letter to us last week and you issued a statement, and the committee has looked at some of the comments that have been made, and we're glad that it reflects the feelings of this committee in three respects. First of all, the Commissioner has requested that another police force should look at the investigation to make sure it's thorough and properly conducted and that it identifies good practice. We think that that's a good idea, but we hope that there is a timetable, because if we're going to get good practice, we need the good practice fed through as quickly as possible. Secondly, the Commissioner said that he believes that there is an imbalance in current legislation, allowing suspects to be publicly named, both before charge, whilst those bringing allegations remain anonymous, and he feels this needs to be addressed. We believe that that's correct, and our predecessor committee, in our inquiry into police bail, which featured the case of Paul Gavaccini, accepted that. And thirdly, he's invited legislators to consider pre-charge publicity for suspects, whether additional legal safeguards are required. We agree that this is an important area, and we will be looking at that as well. So 3 easy wins with us today at the Select Committee. However, how would you describe the way in which the Metropolitan Police has handled the situation regarding the late Lord Britton?
Might be helpful if Steve just outlines the actual process went through in the background, because I think that might help in a very short synopsis.
I think we'd prefer you to answer our questions, and then if you can supplement that later, that would be helpful. I'm asking for an overall view. I think we know the substance of it. How do you think it's been handled?
I think this has been a very difficult and unusual set of circumstances. The rationale behind actions that have been taken, I think, has been absolutely in good faith. The investigation was a search for the truth, is my summary of it, having reviewed all the papers. It was clearly a difficult set of circumstances, but...
You said that twice. That's
Indeed.
not what I asked you. I asked you, how do you think this has been handled? Not that it was difficult. Of course it was difficult, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here today.
No.
How do you think, as the goal commander, this has been handled when a letter of apology goes to the widow of someone who has not been charged with any offence on the day that the BBC decides to broadcast a programme? How do you think it's been handled?
I think these matters have been handled as well as could be in the circumstances, but I absolutely understand the distress caused to Lady Britton. I absolutely recognise I apologised, and for good reason, because at the point that Lord Britton died, I was in negotiations, discussions with the CPS to obtain a view of the evidence in this case, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But latterly, that was in January 2014.
So you would like to apologise to Lady Britton?
Absolutely. I've apologised through her legal team. I would absolutely be happy to do that in person.
And what are you apologising for if you think that it was handled okay?
I do recognise that at the time the victim in this case, the complainant Jane in this case, was updated that there was no prospect of the CPS reviewing the case after Lord Britton died, and that was in April 2014. I recognise that Lady Britton and her legal team should have been updated at that time, and I regret that. That is a failing, and I apologise for that.
So that would have been after he had died?
That's right.
Yes. But the whole of 2013 appears to be, 2014 appears to be you writing to the CPS, asking them to back up your decision. You were playing a bit of ping pong with them.
No, I mean, these are complex circumstances, but the truth of the matter is that the investigation wasn't completed, and the full file of complete evidence arising from that complete inquiry wasn't submitted to the CPS until the 12th of November in 2014. And it was only on the 22nd of November in 2014 did I receive a note indicating the CPS weren't prepared to consider that file. And it was at that point that I appealed, and was in the course of appealing that decision because I felt this was absolutely a case where public confidence was best served for a full and independent review of the circumstances.
Actually, you didn't say that in your letter. You didn't mention public confidence. you said you thought that this was susceptible to media pressure and public cynicism. It wasn't public confidence. Actually, what the Metropolitan Police was doing was really protecting its back.
We don't mind difficult headlines in relation to this issue, but what I do mind.
So why did you say it was media pressure and public cynicism that got you to take so long to make this decision?
What concerns me was the impact that this case would have on people considering coming forward to report serious allegations such as rape. So difficult headlines for the Metropolitan Police, so be it. But what I didn't want is for people to be put off because they had fears that allegations against prominent people wouldn't properly be considered.
You didn't say that in your letter, though, did you? What you said in your letter was that you'd be susceptible to media pressure and a great deal of public cynicism, and therefore you wanted the CPS to make a decision that you couldn't make, which DCI Settle was able to make in the previous year. This was just kept on and on and on while the late Lord Britton was very ill and dying, so he died without being told what you and everyone else in the Metropolitan Police and the CPS already knew.
Well, as we've heard, the investigation was reopened in April 2014, following we've heard from DCI Settle for the reasons why. But thereafter...
What were the reasons in your view? Was it because of Mr Watson's letter?
No, I don't believe it was.
So what do you think it was for? Why was it reopened then?
My understanding is that a colleague of mine who was the Gold Commander at that time...
Who's that?
Commander Graham McNulty, received a briefing in relation to this case. He wasn't satisfied that all aspects of the investigation had been fully conducted, so he therefore commissioned a review. That's a very common practice, a peer review by an experienced investigator, and it was that review that highlighted that there were aspects of the investigation that hadn't been fully completed. And so that was the reason it was carried out.
But on completion of the investigation, you came to exactly the same conclusion that DCI Settle had come to in February when he informed the complainant and also informed Mr Watson. So what I can't understand, what puzzles me, is why did all that take a year and a half? And in the meantime, the late Lord Britton had died with this hanging over his head. I mean, that's really what we're concerned with today.
Absolutely, and I understand that concern. But when the investigation was reopened in late April 2014, the decision was taken following the review. That review completed on the 19th of May. Lord Britton was not arrested, but he was interviewed under caution later that month. Thereafter, other investigations took place. There were some delays. The majority of those delays were caused by Lord Britton's ill health. But it wasn't until the 12th of November that we were in a position to say the investigation from our perspective is complete and submit that to the CPS. And as I say, the rationale behind that, clearly there was consideration as to whether the full code test had been met. That being, was there sufficient evidence to warrant a charge in the matter, in our opinion?
But the CPS kept saying it's nothing to do with them, didn't they? They said, you're the police officers, you'll need to make the decision.
Well, they said in response to the file that DCI Settle submitted that it was an operational matter as to whether or not the police conducted an interview. I have views on DCI Settle's decision at that point. But thereafter, the CPS, in our communications with them, highlighted that there were other aspects of the investigation to be completed. So that was what we did. So the CPS have never reviewed the full file of evidence in this case. The judgment that my officers had to make, and I support...
And you wish they had?
I wish that they had reviewed the file of evidence.
Would you want them to do it now?
I don't know that any purpose will be served now, but that was certainly my intention. Because I think if we take ourselves back to the context of the day, and Mr Winnick highlighted that well in terms of Lord Britton's name was in the press for a number of reasons. There was public speculation over his role in the handling of the Dickens dossier. I myself at this time had to refer a number of cases to the IPCC where people are coming forward to highlight concern over the role of police in investigating prominent people. Lord Britton had been named in the media. So this was a different context, and for reasons of public confidence, because I want people to come forward and report these serious offences in the confidence that the police will tackle them without fear or favour, no matter who is named in the allegation.
But you keep referring in your letter to media pressure and public cynicism rather than the confidence of the public. But let me finally put this to you. Is this not about the politics of fear? When you have prominent people and the public believe, or the press believe, or the cynicism of the public that you refer to, believe that you haven't done a thorough enough job, that people will think that you're letting them off. And therefore, the more famous you are, the more the police will actually want to investigate you.
I think this investigation was following the evidence where it could and conducting a thorough investigation of all the circumstances. That wasn't done within DCI Settle's investigation. I understand his rationale, but there were other inquiries that needed to be conducted before we could say we'd done the job thoroughly.
Okay. We'll stop there and come back after the vote. Thank you. Order, adjourn the committee. Proceedings, the committee is quorate. My apologies, Mr. Rodhouse and Ms. Gallan, for keeping you waiting. Such is life in the House, I'm afraid. Mr. Rodhouse is putting to you a couple of final points about the politics of fear. This is about the police when there is a celebrity or a very famous person. You feel you're under an obligation to check and recheck and to submit files to the CPS and to order new investigations because you're fearful, in your own words, of media criticism and public cynicism. How would you answer that?
Now, I think it's important that we do a thorough investigation on every occasion. But clearly, where the subject material of that investigation is subject to public scrutiny, it's particularly important that we've got it right. It's important that we can reassure the public that if they come forward to report a serious offence, we'll investigate it thoroughly, no matter who the allegation is against. So I don't regard it as politics of fear at all.
And you feel you've now got to the right conclusion on this?
I think so.
Because quite a lot of officers must have looked at this file by now.
Yes, a number have.
There's Mr. Price, there's Mr. Settle. Presumably you've looked at the file before coming to give evidence today. Maybe Patricia Gallan has, maybe the Commissioner has. You're all very satisfied that no further action needed to have been taken.
Well, when the file was submitted in November 2014, it was my judgment then and remains that the full code test wasn't quite met.
No, I'm talking about now. I understand that, you've said that before, but now you're satisfied.
I've seen no evidence to change my view.
Right. So it's exactly the same position as DCI Settle had when he decided to discontinue.
No, I disagree, because now we've completed a full and thorough investigation and Lord Britton was interviewed. He was able to give his account of what happened. And that's really important, really important. Undertaking an interview, it was highly unusual to undertake an investigation of this nature without interviewing the person who's accused. Lots of reasons for that, and if I may, I could outline some of those. But not least, it's important that Lord Britton is able to give his account so we can follow that through. In this case, the CPS advice was that the incident as reported, the jury could have been persuaded that it may have taken place. They did raise significant concerns over whether Lord Britton would have known that Jane wasn't consenting to sex. However, when we spoke to Lord Britton, he didn't raise that as an issue. His account was this incident never took place at all.
Unfortunately, you can't tell us what he said because he's not here to count anything that you said.
Well, I can recount the evidence.
Well, we don't need a rehearsal of the evidence. We're talking about process here and the way in which you've handled it. So you're saying, as far as you're concerned, nothing has been done wrong, but you felt you should apologise to Lady Britton, to conduct a review and to call for changes in the law, but nothing has gone wrong.
Now, as I've said in my letter to Lady Britton's solicitors, clearly I do regret not informing her at the same time that we informed
But that is
Jane.
The only thing you think you've done wrong?
Absolutely. This has been a search for the truth.
So why would you want to have a review then? Another review by another police force to look at good practice if you, as a senior officer of the Met, feels that nothing has gone wrong?
I think it's always good practice to have another pair of eyes, experienced eyes, looking at our investigation to see what lessons we can learn.
And does
for the
that
future.
happen to all the cases that you do? You think it should be reviewed?
Not every case, but where we do think there's value in it, absolutely we will do that. It's a well-established process.
Assistant Commissioner Gallan, who took the decision to remove DCI Settle from his post?
Well, I think we've got to be clear that neither DAC, Rodhouse or I were in post at the time, so we've had to go from documentation at that time, but it seems to be his line managers decided at the time of the review that it was appropriate that the line manager took over that position.
Right. Thank you. Did you know about it? Did senior members of the Metropolitan Police know that he's been removed from his post?
Would you mean now or then?
Well then, I think we all know now.
Okay, well I just wanted to be absolutely clear because I think it's important that we know about what aspect we're talking about.
Well then,
At the time, the commander was aware that a detective superintendent was taking over the investigation.
now there has been a lot of changes announced in the last week. You've disbanded some inquiries, you've put others together. Does that come under your supervision?
They all come under my business group, yes.
Why did you take all these decisions to disband certain inquiries or amalgamate others and change the head of the organisation, that is the unit that is now looking at these cases?
Well, I think it's not in terms of stopping investigations.
No,
It's putting
I
where
didn't
there
say
are
that.
Well, just to be clear, it's where there are links between them, there are crossovers in terms of intelligence and in terms of some witnesses and some allegations. So it's better to have it all under the one detective superintendent. We talked about it in the summer that it was time to do that, and this was an opportune moment to do it, when at the same time we were increasing the resources we're having within the rape command as a result of the Dame Ellis review, and as well as that we're preparing for the public inquiry into child abuse. So we know that we've got to prepare for all of those things, and it's as well having our resources in the one place.
Yes, and the success rate of 400 different pieces of allegations and only 3 convictions, that doesn't seem like a very good success rate to me.
Well, I mean, we can go into it in a lot more detail, but I think that the challenge with rape allegations is they are particularly difficult to get to court. They're also, when they're historical in nature, are very difficult to prove. And I think that shows the challenges of historical investigations. It also shows some of the challenges with this particular investigation. When something has taken place a long time ago and there are probably only very few witnesses, it is going to be a challenge, but it's our job to investigate it and find out what facts we can.
Thank you. Mr. Jardine.
Thank you, Chairman. As Jem said, I'm simply looking at the process here. But first, could I just ascertain from you, I hope the answer is yes, but every British citizen is equal before the law, aren't they?
Yes.
So, taking that a step further, and I'll come back to that point in a moment, DCI Settle is a senior, experienced officer, would you not agree?
Yes.
So when he sought advice from the CPS as part of his investigation, part of the due process, and did so anonymously, we would expect, everyone being equal before the law, that advice was then fair, balanced and appropriate.
Yes.
So why is it then that following a due process being followed and the CPS writing back to the Metropolitan Police on 22nd November saying it didn't meet the appropriate criteria, did the Metropolitan Police believe that it should be appealed due to the strong public interest, which has a strange correlation to a letter that was sent from Tom Watson on the 28th of April 2014?
That was my decision. And as I say, the reason behind that decision was because I thought this was a close-cut case. It was important that the public had reassurance that we'd fully examined all the material. And my reason for the appeal wasn't because that I felt the CPS had made a wrong decision in examining the evidence, it's because I wanted the CPS to consider the evidence so that the public could be reassured that there had been a full and thorough examination of all the facts now the investigation had been completed. Very particularly, and the truth in this is bearing in mind the context of the day in terms of what else was going on.
But it seems to a layman such as myself that you are applying a different test to this investigation. You are possibly being led into certain decisions by parliamentarians, the media and others. You, by your own admission, have said you've taken a decision because you wanted to avoid media criticism. And surely that is not due process. Surely that is not equality before the law.
Now, I wanted the same standards to apply to everyone, but absolutely it was right in a case of such public prominence, of such interest, to check that we'd got our decision-making right, and that was what I was seeking.
Isn't that what you should be doing, though? I mean, you're the senior officer. You should be able to review a case and decide whether it was right, the right process that your officers followed. The CPS has already made its decision clear.
Well, ordinarily, yes, but I think there are a very small number of cases where the public interest is well served by having the evidence reviewed, and that's what I was seeking here.
So, because of the particular individual, you are applying a different test, and a warning therefore should be to all of us around this table and in the chamber across the road that if someone makes an allegation about us, we face a different test in your eyes?
Now, I think that the point, as I said, is the same test needs to be applied. This was about making sure that that test had been correctly applied.
And you don't trust the Detective Chief Inspector to arrive at an appropriate decision?
On this occasion, I've heard DCI Settle's evidence. I'm sure he came to his decision in good faith, but I don't agree with the decision. And the case is there are a number of ways in which you could pursue an investigation. My view was that he should have conducted an interview. But that's not to say his decision was irrational or wrong, but it is to say that other officers reviewing it, and as they have done subsequently, could and did lead to a different conclusion. And in that case, I think it would have been the right thing to do to interview Lord Britton at that point.
But you accept now that the process that Metropolitan Police followed was flawed, caused huge pain to the family, and that is something that you regret?
Well, clearly this investigation has caused pain to the family, but my point is that at the point that Lord Britton died, I was still in discussions with the CPS seeking them to review the evidence, and therefore it wasn't possible to tell Lord Britton or indeed his legal advisors that there was not to be a prosecution.
Thank you, David Burrows.
Yes, just in your view, obviously you were trained, what's the Bible in relation to interviews, as it were, PACE and Code C, 10A, you'll be so familiar with that. So you're disputing the investigating officer's view that there weren't reasonable objective grounds for the suspicion based on known facts and information to enable an interview to take place.
Well, clearly I have a view on that, and I'm happy to talk about that, but probably more importantly, the reviewing officers and their supervisors at the time did. My own view on this is that there were reasonable grounds to suspect an offence had taken place on the basis of what the victim has said. Issues of consent are, as people would judge, in people's mind, and it was entirely appropriate, and there was absolutely, in my view, a legal power to conduct that interview. That was an interview conducted not under arrest, under caution.
Under caution. This is the code's caution.
Yeah.
So there need to be those reasonable objective grounds. So in your full file review, did those include 30 pages of that decision log, which we heard from Officer Settle?
I don't believe that the reviewing officer saw the decision log at that time. The reviewing officer conducted her review on the basis of other documentation. That's not unusual. We have a process within the Metropolitan Police in many cases where a detective chief inspector, decides to take no further action following an allegation of rape and an investigation. We'd run a process called a rape scrutiny panel where we will dip sample and review those investigations. It won't necessarily be done with the decision log in hand because it's a review of the facts at that time.
But when was the first time you looked at that log?
When I looked at that log, that would have been some weeks ago.
Some weeks ago?
Yes.
So that was after you came to the conclusion of wanting to review and then appeal the decision?
Well, the review was
tasked.
The review was tasked in April 2014. I subsequently came into this in July 2014, but it was my decision to appeal to the CPS in November 2014, yes.
Wouldn't it have been helpful to have looked at the original officer's decision log of some 30 pages to be able to give some flavour or reasoning behind the original decision not to pursue an interview?
It may have been, but my judgment, I think, would have remained the same. This was a case where the facts were not clear-cut, as per DCI Settle's evidence, and it was right that an experienced rape prosecutor, in my view, took a view because this was one of a small number of cases where the public interest was better served.
And that public interest, I mean, your view, as we mentioned before, that you've written in your report concerning the reaction and the concern about media criticism and public cynicism. And plainly that has no relevance to the codes of practice. It's not referred to. Public cynicism, media criticism or anything like that isn't referred to in the codes. So that has no relevance to a decision whether to interview.
No, absolutely not. The two issues are separate. My view, for what it's worth, is that there was a legal power to interview Lord Britton and there was no breach of the PACE codes. But latterly, my decision around November was a separate issue.
And on the reaction we heard from the officer said there was blind panic as a result of the intervention of Mr. Watson. and made reference to communications involving a number of officers. What's your response to that?
Well, I wasn't in role at the time, but I have spoken to many who were, and absolutely none of them recall blind panic. The letter from Mr Watson to the DPP was written on the 28th of April. The briefing that gave rise to this review took place a week earlier. The letter was never sent to the Metropolitan Police until the 2nd of June, so we weren't aware of its existence until late May. So the decision to take the review, and indeed the decision to adopt the findings of the review, were taken in isolation from that letter from the DPP. I don't believe there was any influence.
Thank you, Mr Burris. Victoria Atkins and then Stuart MacDonald. We need to make progress, please.
On what grounds did the Metropolitan Police search Lady Britain's homes on the 4th and 5th of March 2015?
I think you're alluding to publicity to do with another operation. That is a live operation where we've never named anyone responsible.
Which we don't wish to know about.
Sorry?
Which we don't wish to know about.
Okay, thank you.
So that was not in relation to Jane, is what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Right. We've heard from DCI Settle about obtaining early investigative advice when he had conduct of the case, and he sent an anonymised report to the CPS, and they duly sent an opinion back saying no further action is required, the evidential test isn't met. Did you anonymise your request to the CPS when you made it?
If I may just address one point, the advice from the CPS didn't say take no further action. It said it was an operational matter for the police, and it was indeed coded saying further action required. We weren't seeking a charging decision, that was early investigative advice. In relation to the file submission in November,
sorry,
that wasn't anonymised.
Forgive me, pause, please. On that, DCI Settle's evidence was that following the advice received from the CPS and in conjunction with further advice received from the CPS, because he made 2 applications, he applied the test and found the evidential test was not met.
It was a police decision based on that evidence. It wasn't a CPS decision. I've seen the advice, and it clearly says that it's an operational matter for the police.
But officer, help me, in complex cases, not just in sexual offences, but in the wider arena of organised crime and terrorism and frauds, it is perfectly normal, indeed it is recommended, that the police or the investigating body seeks advice from counsel on charge. Yes?
Yes.
Why did that not happen in this case then? Why was advice not provided?
At which point, sorry?
As you were making the decision to charge, you say that you sought advice from the CPS.
You weren't making a decision to charge.
I think we need to be very clear. The advice that DCI Settle sought was early investigative advice, a precursor to seeking any decision to charge. We weren't at that stage.
What advice were you seeking in the later stages?
I was asking for the CPS to consider the file. My acknowledgement was that it hadn't quite met the full co-test, but as I've said, this was a case where I thought that it would be valuable for the public interest for the CPS to review that evidence nevertheless, to give the public confidence this has been a robust investigation, and that when prominent people are the subject of allegations, it will be dealt with properly. In the context of an awful lot of stories, and indeed referrals that I'd made in relation to my own force to the IPCC, where people had come forward to say that they had evidence that officers hadn't acted correctly in the past.
So in other words, you wanted the CPS to back your decision, to cover your back?
We wanted to check our decision making, whether we'd made a good decision.
Thank you. Mr MacDonald and Mr Berry.
Mr Rodhouse, you said that DCI Settle's inquiry hadn't been completed entirely. We've also heard about your view on whether or not Lord Britton should be interviewed. Was there anything else that you think DCI Settle should have done which hadn't happened?
Well, I think the interview was clearly the key part, because once Lord Britton had said that he didn't recall the incident, it didn't take place, clearly we needed to address the issue of identification and whether or not Jane had correctly identified Lord Britton as a person who she believed had raped her. So there was a process to establish that, clearly very challenging with the passage of time and a known individual. There were also inquiries to establish whether Jane's description of the location of the offence or the incident was consistent with where Lord Britton had been living, and she also described some aspects of Lord Britton's possessions, and we were seeking to establish whether that was borne out as well.
And none of that had happened under DCI settles investigation?
They were all done, that's right, they were all done subsequently.
Okay, and very briefly, DCI settles applied the following test when making his decision about whether or not to interview Lord Britton. He refers to the Code for Crown Prosecutors, paragraph 4.4, which clearly states a case which does not pass the evidentiary stage must not proceed, no matter how serious or sensitive it may be. Is that the right test he should be applying when considering whether or not to interview Lord Britton?
No, in my view, it's not.
What is the appropriate testing?
When it comes to interviewing, it's a judgment call as to whether or not there are grounds to do so, and whether or not it would add value in any way, shape or form. Because the issue here is that Lord Britton could well have given a cast-iron alibi to suggest he was out of the country at the time of this allegation, in which case my officers are left with trying to establish whether this is a malicious allegation, and we've taken action in respect of those fairly recently too, or whether or not Jane was mistaken in her identity. So there are issues that arise from an interview that I don't think were adequately covered by DCI Settle's rationale.
How many cases? Sorry, Mr. Burrows. Mr. Burrows. Order, Mr. Burrows. Just on point of clarification, how much action have you taken in respect of malicious allegations?
I don't have statistics for you, but I'm aware of a case within the last 2 or 3 months where that exactly was the case, where an allegation was made against a prominent individual. We believed it to be malicious and false, and therefore action was taken. Thank
you. Sorry, Mr. Burrows, please.
You formed a judgment on the substance and extent of what DCI Styles' investigation was in terms of the stage that it got to and the decisions not to interview, without actually looking at the log. I'm not sure how you can properly come to that judgment.
The log is not the only place where his decision-making was documented, so there are...
It's a key document.
It is a key document, but I'm satisfied with the judgments that have been made on the information.
And you said in response to Stuart Madonna that a decision about whether to interview, you also said, or whether there's any added value. Now, I don't see reference to or any other added value in the guidance to code of practice. I mean, that opens up anyone when an allegation, a serious allegation or minor allegation is made. If you can get an added value out of it, you're up for interview. Now, that doesn't seem to be the lawful, does it?
Added value is potentially clumsy wording, but to prove or disprove the offence, I think, might be better.
James Berry, finally.
Are you saying that the guidance on what you can refer to the CPS should effectively be amended so that you can refer cases to the CPS when you can't make up your mind whether the evidential threshold's been met? And secondly, where the evidential threshold has in fact not been met, but you think there's a wider public interest in having a second opinion?
Yes, we are. I've written to the DPP and discussed it with her. The reason for that is about transparency. It's not about us trying to cover our backs or justify at all. It's rather there are a number of matters which are of public interest, where in the past people haven't had confidence that police will do a full investigation, and we know that by the number of referrals to the Independent Police Complaints Commission alleging corruption in the past by police officers. And as a result of that, there are a very small number of cases which are either involving things like police corruption, high-profile individuals, or in terms of being very complex, where the evidential test hasn't been met. So in other words, we as a police service aren't trying to push it up and say, we think there's a case here, because that would be entirely wrong. Rather, we're saying, we've searched for all the evidence we can get, we don't think there's any more. We would respect and seek the advice of an independent prosecutor in whichever area of criminality to review that case for us. They may come back and say, you've made entirely the right decision. Or, as happens in some occasions, very helpfully, they say, you haven't followed all the lines of inquiry. Have you thought about X? And I think it's really important for public confidence. It's really important for people out there at large to know that we will take their allegations seriously and that we'll follow them through. And also that we are not judge and jury, that we will always seek other people to review our decisions as well, where appropriate.
Do you see the risk that in cases of public interest, and most cases involving high-profile individuals could well be described as falling into that category, you could be seen as passing the buck?
Well, I think that could be seen in that way if we were saying they've met the evidential test. We're not saying that. We're being quite open and honest. And in fact, in the case of Leon Britton, I was quite clear in my part, as if the CPS weren't willing to make the decision, we, the police, would make the decision and be quite clear why we've made it. So I think we need to be very direct about that. It isn't a case of passing the buck. It's about us being transparent and open, where we haven't always been in the past, and about saying what the facts of cases are. But in terms of prominent people, it comes to the very fact of what the Commissioner has spoken about why Parliament, and it is for all of you, to consider whether additional safeguards need to be put in. It's important that I emphasise at no point until last week did the police service put the name of Leon Britton into the public domain.
Oh, no one's disputing that.
But I think it's really important, because I think it's one of the issues that needs to be got across. There are a number of safeguards that we need to consider.
Mr. Lawton has a final very quick question. We have to move on.
Firstly, you, Mr. Rodhouse, have described this as a close-cut case. DCI Settle described it as the evidential basis fell at the first hurdle. How can there be such a disparity between colleague police officers open to the same amount of facts and information on a case like this?
I can't account for DCI Settle's decision making. I think that clearly, if you take the DCI Settle's view as fact, and I don't, then clearly there would be a long way between us in terms of law. But if you take an alternative view that it was entirely open to him to conduct an interview, the natural course would have been to conduct the inquiries that I outlined earlier, and actually we wouldn't have been too far apart. This is, I've not put the details of the allegation into the public domain for obvious reasons, and I don't propose to do so, but my judgment is that it isn't clear-cut.
But you can see why it is worrying. If it depends which police officer you go to, you may get a completely different decision. But can I just, very finally, just probe you on the public interest better served point, which Deputy Commissioner just made as well. Is it the case, therefore, on what constitutes public interest, that if Leon Britton had been another, that you would have taken the decision not to reopen the investigation?
I don't believe that to be the case. We commonly receive letters from MPs, campaigners, around individual allegations, particularly where the victim in that case, the complainant, doesn't believe there to be a thorough investigation. We listen to them all, we address them, and absolutely we would undertake a review. In fact, that's now been enshrined in process. Since April this year, sorry if I may finish, since April this year there has been a victim's right to review where no further action has been taken in respect of rape allegations. And what that means is, if the victim in the case is unhappy with the police investigation, it will be reviewed by a different officer.
So you don't think that the decision would have been any different to reopen the case if Leon Britton had been an ordinary member of the public?
Absolutely.
Thank you. One final point about the Gambaccini case. Is Operation U-Tree under you, Patricia?
Yes, it is.
It is. And I'm sure you've had the opportunity of reading the committee's report on police bail.
Yes.
We've just received a letter from the DPP, which we will raise with her, so I'm raising it with you, as to the length of time it took to inform Mr. Gambaccini that there was no action being taken against him. And she's informed us that the police wrote to her in February 2014 with the initial papers, but it took a further 7 months to get the entire file from the police to the CPS. So I'm just a little puzzled. On the one hand, you keep wanting the CPS to give you advice, and on a case like Paul Gambaccini's, which is in the public domain, which we have discussed, and indeed he's written a book about it, it took you 7 months to actually send the file. Why was that?
Well, I haven't got all the details, and I'll need to have a look at the DPP's letter, but I surmise that we've asked for early investigative advice, and then at some stage we'll have put in the full file, which isn't unusual. That cases we will work hand in hand with the CPS. We will very often put evidence in along the way, and at the final stage we will submit the full file. I'll happily look into the case for you and write back a response when I know all the details.
But it's a very... the DPP's going to give evidence in a minute. Well, not in a minute, shortly. It's a long wait, isn't it? 7 months. It just mirrors what's happened in this case. This all could have been done so much quicker. The late Lord Britton could have been informed if the processes of the Metropolitan Police could have been quicker. No one's to blame individually for this. It's a system that allows delay to actually prevent what the Home Secretary talked about, which is timely information.
I understand that, and we all want timely investigations. I think I'll need to look into all of the circumstances. However, what I would say is that investigations very often are complex. It involves meeting victims in all areas of the country. We've got to, in occasions, evidence that takes some time to retrieve back in terms of its telecoms and such like. So cases aren't always straightforward. I'm talking about the generality rather than the specifics of the Mr Gamboncini's case. The specifics of that I will look into because I know the broad details
Thank you
of
very
it
much.
and happily
If you
write
could
back to you.
Let us have an answer by Friday, I'd be very grateful.
Unfortunately, that might be a little challenging because I won't be here, so if you could give me a little bit more time, that would be helpful.
Are you also abroad on operational matters?
I'm not on operational matters, but I won't be here, so if I can have a little bit more time, I will personally ensure you get an answer.
Okay. That's very kind.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Commissioner, Deputy Assistant Commissioner. Most grateful.